you'd remain standing for the reading of the gospel lesson. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the word of God for the people of God. Please be seated. I can imagine that Zebedee let out a deep sigh as he stood in the hallway of the boys' elementary school. He paused just a moment outside the principal's office, then tentatively turned the doorknob. The call he received to come visit her had come as no surprise. In fact, it was becoming an all too familiar routine. His sons, James and John, were quite the pair, very spirited young men. "What'd they do this time?" he asked, more out of resignation than curiosity. "Well, this afternoon, James thought he saw another boy bump into John in the lunchroom. It was an accident, but James got involved, and you know." Yeah, he knew. It wasn't that his sons were not good boys. They made top grades, they tested well, even shared their supplies and snacks with those who had less. But they were also feisty. Some described them as highly competitive. Whenever they chose sides for kickball on the playground, each insisted on being captain of opposing teams. They always managed to work their way to the front of any line, regardless of when they joined it. In class, if the teacher asked a question, their hands were the first two in the air. Under different circumstances, you would expect these brothers to go far in life with their abundant energy and inner drive. But Zebedee's family were fisher folk. They did okay, provided a decent living, but none of that clan ever thought of going to college or becoming professionals, much less do it. That's just the way it was. Then one day, these brothers were sitting in their boat, minding their own business, mending their nets. The Rabbi Jesus, an itinerant preacher, walked by, seemingly out of nowhere, and insisted them to follow him. In a burst of spontaneity, they just up and left everything right there on the spot. All their fishing gear, their friends and neighbors, even their stunned father still sitting in the boat, and followed Jesus without a clue what it would mean or where it would lead. As the days stretched into months, the brothers were loving every minute of their decision. They watched as Jesus healed people of diseases and injured limbs, as he cast out demons in dramatic fashion. And they loved it when Jesus got into arguments with religious leaders, their competitive natures rising, pushing them to the front row. They were so excited they could barely sleep, wondering what the next day would bring. Best of all was when Jesus talked about what he called the kingdom of God. The time that when it was coming when Jesus would rule the earth, kick out the Romans and set up shop. They sensed that day was near. Finally, they were so close to a stage big enough to allow them to express their ambition, to show the world what they were made of. Well, that's how James and John must have experienced their time with Jesus. But the writer of Mark's gospel, from the perspective of the narrator, gives us a different perspective. Jesus was certainly an exciting figure, but in his words and actions, he also communicated deeper truths. All 12 of the disciples, including our two brothers, never seemed to grasp the darker side, the painful backlash that came when challenging the powers that be, probably because they didn't want to see it. At first, Jesus' ministry took him through dusty villages and the rural countryside of the Galilean hills. But then something stirs within him. He makes the crucial, pivotal move to head toward Jerusalem, where he knows that he will die. In fact, 3 different times he tells his disciples explicitly what will happen. I'm going to Jerusalem, where I will be arrested, tortured, and killed, and after 3 days rise again. You might think this would grab their attention, but instead of responding by expressing alarm or asking questions, or even trying to comfort Jesus, they just act as if he never said it. Nothing to see here. The first time Jesus makes this statement, Peter actually pulls him aside and reprimands him for such talk, a move Jesus doesn't much appreciate. Get behind me, Satan, he says. When Jesus says it a second time, a few days later, the disciples inexplicably respond by getting into an argument among themselves about which one is greater. Well, Jesus can only roll his eyes at this and let out an exasperated sigh. Do they not hear what he's saying? That's when he calls over a little child, takes it in his arms, and says to the disciples, so you want to know who's the greatest in the kingdom? Let's start with this little fella here. And just before today's text, we come to the third announcement. Listen to me carefully, Jesus tells them. When we get to Jerusalem, the Son of Man will be betrayed to the religious leaders. They will sentence him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Romans, who will mock him and spit on him and kill him. Well, this time our schoolyard brothers, James and John, pull Jesus aside. We would like for you to do something for us, Jesus, whatever we ask, and no backsies. When you come into your kingdom, will you promise to move us to the head of the class? One to sit on your left, one to sit on your right. We don't really care which is which. Well, how gracious. Weren't they not listening? Jesus has just poured his heart out to them and for them. He is willing to put everything on the line for them, including his life. And in that moment, all they can do is ask for special favors for themselves. Before we come down too hard on James and John, let's think about this a minute. Even though they are self-absorbed, and they demonstrate tremendous faith in Jesus. They're able to see beyond the present moment, beyond a poor itinerant preacher with a scraggly bunch of followers. And they are able to catch the vision which Jesus has been projecting, one where God will rule with justice and peace, and they want to be part of it. Wherever Jesus is taking them, however misguided their understanding of the kingdom may be. Jesus gets that. And so instead of snapping at these sons of entitlement with a biting, who do you think you are? He shows great patience and keeps the conversation going by asking them an open-ended question. What do you want from me? When he hears their answers, wanting special favors, he seems to respond more out of sadness than anger. You have no idea what you're asking. In order to get to the glory of the kingdom, I'm going to have to go through the horrors of confronting the powers of domination and fear and death. Are you ready for that? We're ready, they say. Bring it on. Of course, that's easy to say when you haven't hit the rough waters yet, when you haven't felt the stinging lash or been in the valley of disappointment. It wasn't that long ago that they had been with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus was suddenly transformed into glory with Moses and Elijah right there with him. They were present when Jesus announced his coming death, but they really only heard that last bit about how he would rise from the dead. Are they really ready? Are we really ready to follow Jesus anywhere? Parker Palmer has blessed many people, especially through his writing on the spirituality of teaching. He tells about a time when he was offered the presidency of a small educational institution. He wanted the job and he thought he should take it, but in order to work through his decision, he drew upon the Quaker tradition and assembled what was called a clearness committee. This was half a dozen trusted friends whose job wasn't to give advice, but to ask honest, open-ended questions so that Parker could discern this calling for himself. This was a serious time of discernment with 3 hours set aside for the process. About halfway through the meeting, a friend asked Parker, "What will you like most about being president of this institution?" And Parker mentioned several things that he wouldn't enjoy, like wearing a tie. Okay, but that sounded more like avoiding the question than answering it. Parker says that he paused, thought a bit, and then he said, "I gave an answer that appalled even me as I spoke it. Well, I said in the smallest voice I possess, I guess what I would like most is getting my picture in the paper with the word president underneath it." And then he writes, "I was sitting with seasoned Quakers who knew that although my answer was laughable, my mortal soul was clearly at stake. They didn't laugh. Instead, they went into a long and serious silence, a silence which he says I could only sweat and inwardly groan. Finally, my questioner broke the silence with a question that cracked all of us up and cracked me open. Parker, can you think of an easier way to get your picture in the paper?" And by then it was obvious, even to me, that my desire to be president had more to do with my ego than with the ecology of my life. The Clearness Committee had made things clear, and he withdrew his name from the search. What is it that we truly desire, and why do we desire it? Do we seek a glory that is fleeting, an assurance of security even if it demands our soul? Are we looking to somehow bypass the cross with its suffering and shame and find grace on the cheap? It wasn't long before the 10 other disciples got wind of what James and John had asked Jesus. They knew these brothers too well, so they weren't surprised, but they also weren't happy that they had gone behind their backs yet again to try to leverage an advantage over the rest of them. Things got heated, but before it came to physical blows, Jesus stepped in to settle them down. Look at yourselves, fighting to show who's bigger and badder. You're just like everybody else, especially those godless rulers. They get a little power and it goes to their heads. But that's not the way of love. Whoever wants to be great must be a servant. This is exactly what I have done. I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. Well, at least the disciples are consistent. They can't seem to grasp this self-giving message of Jesus, although he is right in front of them, teaching them, setting the example. They continually turn the spotlight on themselves, wondering how the latest change in current events will affect them, what their destiny will be in this world and in the next. I can relate. I get caught up in those things too. And sometimes we have to be somewhat selfish, especially in times of crisis or when we are threatened in some way. But to stay there doesn't move us toward abundant life. Jesus is also consistent, turning the spotlight always back to God, revealing what it means to live in the realm where God reigns, where we focus on the common good, not just on what's best for us, where justice isn't dispensed according to a person's wealth or skin tone or gender or zip code. Making seat assignments for the head table in the coming kingdom is not in my job description, Jesus says. That's partly because he won't be in the center seat at the head table. He plans to be in the kitchen plating food, or at the door taking coats, or in the dining room bussing tables, whatever needs to be done. Jesus takes the role of a servant not because it's his assignment, it's just what he does, it's who he is. Jesus said that he came to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. That's a word that seems to drop in out of nowhere, and it's not one we use every day. We usually think of ransom as paying off someone who has kidnapped a loved one or taken something of value hostage, demanding payment for release. This saying has led some to ask who Jesus has to pay and for what. Well, Mark has already established his belief that this world is held captive under the influence of Satan. Is that who needs to be paid? Others have speculated that God is the one needing to be paid off. A God angry with humanity for all the sin that causes division and so much pain. Maybe Jesus needs to satisfy the wrath of God. But neither of those meanings are present in the current context of this text. The concern here is not sin or wrath. It's about dominance and servitude. The temptation is to rely on power as defined by this world, one where we exert influence, making ourselves look good, by being in control, by thinking ourselves sufficient, by having more than other people. The lust for that power locks us in a prison of our own illusions, where others are considered as threats or rivals instead of peers in God's eyes. We need deliverance from that. And if Jesus needs to give his life in order for us to realize that he's willing to do it. Martin Luther calls this a marvelous exchange. Jesus takes our brokenness and we receive God's wholeness. When I submitted the title for this sermon, I was thinking about the audacity of what James and John asked of Jesus, that they would be granted the best positions when Jesus came into his kingdom. But now I'm beginning to think that Jesus is the audacious one. Imagine the faith it takes to believe that God is breaking into this world in a new way. Imagine the wellspring of hope that enables a person to keep going even when they know that what lies ahead is not pleasant, even dangerous. And then imagine that God is offering this new life to everyone, inviting us to find meaning and purpose, community and love, waiting with eager anticipation for our answer. Amen.